Okay, you guys, so I want to thank you guys for joining me again for another episode. I know I haven't been on in a while. It's been a little bit of a stretch since I've made a video, but just like my favorite little Kim, I've been gone for a minute. I'm back with the jump off. So if you guys have followed me on Instagram or other social media, Facebook, you know that I have found this really great recipe for homemade biscuits, fresh biscuits. I didn't grow up making biscuits from scratch. We always made like Bisquick mix biscuits. And so when I found this and I found out how easy it was, I definitely wanted this to be something that I shared on my channel. So it's first thing in the morning, so that's why hair is tied up, no makeup, all of that. So bear with me. And this is going to be an edited video as well because I'm shooting this on my phone as opposed to doing it live from my laptop. So I have my sifter. This sifter I got from Sur La Table, and it's like the old-fashioned one with the little almost like a whisk thing in the middle. They also have the ones like my grandmother used to have with the trigger that you kind of pull back and forth, and it has a little fan at the bottom that shakes, you know, rotates back and forth and sifts your flour or whatever. I wanted to use this one because sometimes doing that, I remember being a little kid and having to sift flour for my grandmother to make pie crusts and cakes and things like that, and it gets to you after a while. So I have a glass bowl that I put in the freezer because you really want all of your ingredients to be really cold. My butter is in the refrigerator, and this has just a few ingredients, and so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to need a 1 cup and a quarter of flour, and you can use all-purpose flour if you have it, but I don't have all-purpose flour, so I am going to get out my measuring spoon, and I am, because this is a 1/4, I guess I could have just used, that's the quarter, and then this is the cup. And it's biscuits, so it doesn't have to be super exact. And I'm going to put that in there. Now, let me get a small spoon. And you're also going to need, because this is not self-rising flour, you're going to have to add some baking soda. And I am going to use teaspoon and a half of baking soda, and then I'm going to also use baking powder. So the baking soda and the baking powder in this is what's going to actually help your biscuits to rise. Flour on its own doesn't have anything that will make it rise, and you'll get really like, they'll be super thick crackers basically if you don't add the baking soda and the baking powder. And honestly, it's better to use more than to use less. Slightly more obviously than less, because you don't want them to not rise when you put them in the oven. So I'm going to take my sifter now, and we're just going to sift this, and this is going to take a couple minutes. And then I'm going to put this back in the freezer because you really want this to be super cold when you add the butter to it. And so I'm going to get this sifted, and then I'm going to put this in the freezer for about 10 minutes. And I'm going to then be back with the next part of the video. So, and I know I haven't shot a video on my phone in a while, and that's why I keep looking at the screen instead of looking at you guys, and I do apologize. So, I'll be back. Okay, you guys, so I'm back, and I thought to myself, I'm going to make a full breakfast. I'm going to make the biscuits. I also have some bacon that's in the oven baking now, and I'm going to do some grits and some eggs. It's Sunday morning, so, you know, we do what we do. Now, I do want to just make sure that I state for the record, I do my bacon in the oven because that's the only way that I ever learned how to do it. To me, when you make bacon on the stove, it comes out extremely uneven, and I don't like uneven bacon. I don't like for my bacon to be unevenly cooked or to have pieces in it that are still very chewy or don't feel like cooked all the way through. So while my bacon is in the oven and my flour, baking powder, and baking soda is in the freezer, I'm going to start on my grits. So let me get my grits out here. And I can't say I only use Quaker grits, but this is what I have right now. And typically I do get the Quaker grits. So 1 serving of grits calls for a 1/4 cup. I'm going to do a 1/2 cup. And then 2 cups of water, because 1 cup for 1 serving. So let me get my measuring cup out. Okay, and so I always, through trial and error, have learned that when I'm doing things that are like grits or rice, I always go a little less with the amount of water. So if this is calling for 2 cups of water, I will do maybe 1 cup and 3/4. And that's just because, to me, you can always add water later, especially when I'm making rice. Usually, if I make rice, I do the 2-to-1 ratio that everybody says you're supposed to use. It typically comes back where the rice isn't, it's like too wet. And I don't really care for my rice to be wet like that. So we have 1 cup and 2/3 of water in the pot. That's on high now. And then I'm going to measure out my 1/2 cup of grits, and I'll put that to the side so that way it's ready when I need to add it to the water. I'm also going to put some salt in there. One thing I hate is bland grits. Okay, so now my grandmother never measured anything. She just kind of eyeballed it, but I just find that they put the recipe or the numbers on the back of the package for a reason, and I tend to go with that. So I am going to add just a pinch of some salt to this water. And then that's one of the things that I forgot in my biscuit mix is just a little bit of salt. I'm going to add to that as well when I pull it out of the freezer. Now, I was at the grocery store last week and they had, my oven is preheated, but the bacon's already in there. They had butter, but it was, instead of being separated into whole sticks, it was separated into 8 half-stick portions. And so that's really, really good because this recipe for my biscuits actually calls for a 1/2 stick of butter. So before I pull the flour mix out of the freezer, I'm going to get a cutting board out and a knife. What I like to do, because it takes, so normally when you add butter, you chop it up into cubes and then you add it to the flour, and then you have to use a fork or a biscuit cutter to cut what's called cutting the butter into the flour. What I have found to be a little bit easier is that if I slice the butter, and I'll show you how to do it. I slice the butter thin, and then when you put it and mix it with the flour, there's just less cutting that you have to do. So preparation versus a whole lot of work later. So this is the 1/2 stick of butter. So cute, right? And I'm going to just unpeel this, and of course my hands, I had already washed them. I'll wash them again just because, you know, people will say, oh, she didn't wash her hands on camera. And so you guys won't be able to see this as I'm doing it because I have the camera on a tripod, but I will kind of pull this up here so you guys can see it as I go along. Okay, so what I did is I took the butter and I cut it in half this way and then in thirds that way. And now I'm gonna go in and just put very thin slices to this, so that way when it goes and gets mixed into the flour, it's already in really, really small pieces. And so I'll show you what that looks like. And you want this to be like as thin as you can get it. This butter was in the refrigerator. A lot of people use completely frozen butter, but I just find that completely frozen butter is way too difficult to work with. And then, you know, a lot of people use frozen butter and they will use their food processor. But I don't see the point of using the food processor because then it's just another thing that I have to clean. If this is something that I can do by hand, why not go ahead and do it this way? And so, all right. And so I'm going to show you guys what this looks like. And that didn't take any time at all. But the butter is in these really thin sort of flakes. And then when you add it to your flour mixture, all of those flakes of butter are going to get coated in the flour. And when you make your biscuit dough and it goes into the oven to bake, your biscuits go in the oven to bake, that butter is going to melt and it's going to create these little pockets where steam is going to get in there, and it'll also help the biscuits to rise. So let me grab my flour mix out of the freezer. And so you can see the flour mix, and I gotta add some salt here. So I'm gonna add, half teaspoon of salt. You don't want your biscuits to be too salty, but you don't want this to be bland either. And I only use unsalted butter at home. And so I'm just gonna stir that salt in. And my grits, the water for my grits is boiling. So I'm gonna turn that down to low and add my grits. And we'll give that a quick stir. I hope you guys can hear me okay on this video. I'm going to be very disappointed if I have to do a voiceover. I have my back door open because it's still pretty early, but I'm getting ready to close it because my AC just kicked on, which lets me know that it's pretty hot outside at this time of day. It's 10:15. So I'm going to add, now I'm going to add my butter. There we go. And now I am going to take a fork and I'm going to cut this in with a fork. I could have put the fork in the freezer too, but I don't think it's going to matter because everything in here is so cold. But because I have already made the pieces of butter so small, I won't have to cut this so much. You just want to make sure that there are no really, really large pieces of butter. And basically when you're cutting it, I'm going to see if I can pull this up here. You are taking your fork and pressing it against the bottom of the bowl and sort of pulling down into it. It works well if you have like a really, really flat bottom bowl as well. Or if you have a biscuit cutter, because they sort of have the rounded sides to them. Turn that way down low. And so it's going to take just a few minutes for me to get this all done. And then when I get done with this, I'm going to put this back in the freezer because I want all of those chunks of butter to be really, really cold when I make my biscuits and when I roll them out. And I'm not really, this recipe doesn't really call for a lot of rolling or kneading. You're basically going to mix everything together and then, you know, cut out your biscuits. So I'm going to go around this bowl a couple of times just to make sure I don't have any big chunks of butter. And this is a super easy biscuit to make, so this is great. You can, this recipe that I'm doing today is probably going to make about 4 to 6 biscuits. And I actually halved the recipe for this morning because I made biscuits like last week and I never ate all of the biscuits, and I really don't like to waste food, so I'm really just going to make enough biscuits for now. And as you're doing this, you'll see that the color of the flour actually changes a little bit. It goes from that really, really bright white of your flour to having this slightly beige color, and that's just because you're cutting the butter into the flour and it's just slightly coloring the flour. And so this is what it looks like. You see how it just sort of has like a crumbly texture to it. Those are little pieces of butter, but you don't see, I'm sorry, you don't see any large clumps. This is not, actually no, I need to take those out, I'm sorry. Okay. That's why you always stir it with your fork to check. That definitely will help you to know if you need to cut that in a little bit more. So let's see here. All right, so that's what it's gonna look like. Nice and crumbly. And this has the salt added in it now. So I'm gonna put it back in the freezer. And we'll let the bacon and the grits cook a little bit more, and I'll be back shortly. I got my dry mix with the butter, and now I'm going to measure out a half a cup of buttermilk. I forgot to tell you, these are buttermilk biscuits. Shake up the buttermilk really good. I'm trying to hold that. That's just the bubbles, but it is a half a cup. This oven is already preheated to 385. I always set my oven a little bit higher than whatever my target temperature is, just because I know my oven at this point, and it's always just a few degrees short of what I need it to be. So I'm going to take buttermilk. We're going to add that right in there. And then we're just going to bring down any extra buttermilk in there. Now we're going to mix this until it is barely combined. And just bring it together with the fork. It's going to be slightly a crumbly dough. You will see the dots of the butter in the dough. You're supposed to see that. And you could also put your buttermilk in the freezer for that last 10 minutes, just so everything is ice cold. But my refrigerator is pretty cold on its own. So now this is a little dry. It hasn't quite come together. I'm gonna add just a little bit more buttermilk, and when you add buttermilk to something that's already been mixed once, you really want to kind of spread it out. You don't want to put it in just like a dollop in the middle, because it's going to make it that much easier to mix in and to incorporate. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And so now this is what it should look like. It's just come together. There's no crumbly bits in the bottom. None of the flour, so it's all sort of bound itself into a nice lump, a mound. Now I'm going to take and flour my cutting board. This is what I'm going to use to shape these biscuits. And I don't need much flour because I'm not making a whole mess of biscuits. But this is my cutting board. And so I'm going to bring this out. I'm going to put this on the cutting board. I'm going to rinse my hands. I'm going to see if I can't get you guys to a better angle so you can see. I mean, this isn't going to take but a couple seconds, but it may help someone to see this process. So we're just going to take this. I'm going to, because I like to have the floured side on the top, you're just going to flatten this out. I like to flatten it over once, flatten it out again, twice, four, and then now this is the corner from each time, so I'm going to bring that up here. Now I'm going to shape this into a circle, a sort of circle, and this is still cold. You want to touch this as little as possible, and we're just going to get this to kind of the thickness that we want it. And that's about right for me. Got a nice clean glass. And we're just going to cut out our biscuits. That little sound of the air escaping when you cut your biscuits is my favorite sound in the morning. So that's 2. And then we're just going to bring this together and reshape it. Now, obviously the first 2 biscuits that you make are going to be sort of your best biscuits because they're not going to be brought together. Okay, and now we got number 3. And then this last one is what my pops would call the hoe cake. I don't know where that name comes from, but it's basically the last biscuit, and it is whatever's left over that you can't actually cut a biscuit. So I wouldn't be able to get 2 biscuits out of that. So you just make like a really big biscuit. And so you always want your biscuits to be as close as possible in the pan that you're going to cook them in. And so I'm going to use a smaller pan than I would use if I had more biscuits. And then what I also like to do, this helps to keep them from sticking, even though this is a non-stick pan. Take a little bit of your baking powder and sprinkle it on the bottom of the pan. Baking powder itself doesn't burn, so it's not going to do the same thing that, let's say, if you had used flour on the bottom. Oh, you know what? Let me move this over here. And by putting your biscuits together like this, they're going to help to rise up against each other. So I'm going to take this and put it in the oven. And I usually start my biscuits on the bottom rack. Let me bring you guys back over here. So I usually start my biscuits on the bottom rack, and that allows them to get as much heat into the bottom of the pan and into the bottom of the biscuit so they rise up really nicely. And then if they rise up really good and they're not quite brown yet, I will then transfer them to the top rack. But normally I don't have to do that. Every now and again I will. And then the other thing is, if I'm making a larger pan of biscuits, I will actually cook my biscuits in my cast iron skillet, one of my cast iron skillets. And what I will do with that is I'll put the pan, my skillet, into the oven to let it heat up really well. Cast iron holds on to heat really well, but it also takes a long time for it to heat up. And so you put your cast iron skillet into the oven. You let it come up to temperature, and then you just sprinkle your baking powder in the bottom of your cast iron skillet, lay your biscuits in there, and put it right back in the oven. And that gives you a biscuit with a really, really nice, I don't want to say crunchy bottom to it, but the bottom of the biscuit is really, really well done, and has that a bit of a more done texture, I guess, toasted texture to it. 12 to 15 minutes. On 375. I'm gonna get my workspace cleaned off and I'll be back shortly. Okay, you guys, I'm back. The biscuits are done, the grits are done. I'm gonna kind of plate everything up for you. I did not have to move the biscuits to the top rack to brown, and they came out just like this. So, all right, you guys, so the biscuits are done. This is what they look like, and I'm gonna use my flat-ended spatula, wooden spatula, to just cut out one of these biscuits. And they're really hot still because they just came out of the oven. But that is what the biscuit looks like. And I'm sure you guys can see the steam on the top of that. So I'm gonna break this open. That is what you want. Beautiful. It should just like fall apart. And all of those little pockets in there, that's where the butter was. So hopefully you guys will try this biscuit recipe with your next breakfast. Invite your friends over, and you know, they can give you their honest feedback. And if you like the recipe, definitely leave a comment. If you have any concerns or suggestions, definitely let me know. You guys also know how to reach out to me on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, all of that stuff. So like, comment, and subscribe on this video, and I look forward to bringing you something really great next week. I'm gonna have a couple more pieces of bacon, and I'm gonna get some grits, and I'm gonna have some breakfast. Y'all have a great rest of your week.